Justin Trudeau. When will Canada's Prime Minister finally admit that he fell for a hoax? The media as well. Yet another race hoax, much bigger than the Jussie Smollett one. When will Trudeau confess that he fell for a hoax 2 years ago that led to dozens of churches being burned, Catholics smeared, the late Queen Elizabeth defamed as a child stealer, plus a national day of mourning? A hoax that today sees that same poisonous story being recycled, this time in Australia. I'm talking about this bombshell story, that the remains of 215 Indian children have been found buried at a former residential school run by Catholics in Kamloops, British Columbia, a claim immediately treated as true and horrific by news outlets around the world, including in Australia, and of course by America's media left.
The discovery is astounding, and so too the anguish, leaving community members and much of Canada reeling. The remains of 215 children, some as young as 3, buried for decades on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, their deaths believed to be undocumented, graves unmarked. The Indigenous community in British Columbia calls it an unthinkable discovery, and yet former students of the school, like Harvey McLeod, who was subjected to abuse there, tell us they've thought of nothing else for decades.
Shocking, right? But even then, the known facts should have made politicians and journalists pause for a second, because, for a start, no bodies had actually been found. All that had happened was that ground-penetrating radar had found evidence of disturbed soil. And the researchers, for some reason, immediately jumped to an explosive conclusion. These were probably graves of children. And the media, well, they went, yes, of course, what do you expect of those wicked Catholics? So evil, the way they claim they actually helped children back then, saved them from poverty, gave them an education. All lies, of course, they were monsters. And Prime Minister Trudeau fanned the hysteria, tweeting, "The news that remains were found at the former Kamloops residential school breaks my heart. It is a painful reminder of that dark and shameful chapter of our country's history. I'm thinking about everyone affected by this distressing news. We are here for you." You've got to remember that even then, I repeat, in talking about remains, no remains had been found. Even the researchers admitted they weren't even sure that these really were graves. Then you'd have to really be a bigot to assume that Catholic clergy, with their religion's stress on the sanctity of life, would casually fling children's bodies in unmarked graves all over the school grounds. I guess Trudeau was so in love with his superior morality, right? And this was a Gothic horror story that many on the left wanted to believe. A story about evil British colonialism, about a corrupt and depraved Catholic Church, about poor Indigenous victims that white saviours like Trudeau could cry over. The media even aired, this is how mad it was, they even aired a preposterous claim by a so-called spirit dancer who said he was a boy at Kamloops and saw with his own eyes Queen Elizabeth lead off 10 children from a picnic they were all at, children never seen again.
The Queen can visit for about 3 days, 2-3 days. I don't know how long it was. I think it was about 3 days actually, and a lot of children went missing there.
In mid-October of 1964, kissing cousins Elizabeth and Philip paid a royal visit to a Catholic residential school for Aboriginal children in Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. The group that disappeared was 7 boys and 3 girls in age from 6 to 14 years old. They were all from the smart group in the class.
Can you believe it? By the way, that's the only part of this whole hoax that's since been accepted as perhaps a pack of bull. Absolute nonsense. The Queen was in Canada that year, but on the other side of the country, didn't go to the school then. Besides, how crazy do you have to be to think that the Queen goes and interrupts a royal tour of Canada, media everywhere, to go steal children? But like I said, the hysteria in Canada, the hysteria then was just off the charts. I mean, protesters seized this opportunity, seized on this bad news story about Catholics to burn 25 churches and attack nearly 40 more. They'd even destroyed churches built by Copts who'd fled persecution in Egypt. A church built by Vietnamese who'd fled persecution by communists. Welcome to persecution in Canada. Now, Justin Trudeau back then said, of course, burning these churches, that's bad. That is bad. But he said it was also totally understandable.
One of my reflections is I understand the anger that's out there against the federal government, against institutions like the Catholic Church. It is real and it is fully understandable.
Talk about almost literally adding petrol to the fire. Trudeau even declared a day of national mourning for these poor children, and all around the country, people left shoes on steps as a symbol of mourning and their compassion. It was an orgy of virtue signalling with no thought at all to, hello, is any of this actually true? Because here is the awkward truth. After 2 years, not one single body has been found in those supposed graves. Not one of the alleged 215 children supposedly buried there has been found. Now, not all of these supposed graves have been examined yet, but that's perhaps no wonder because it was already getting very embarrassing. Some of the disturbances were just things like tree roots or whatever, no bodies at all. But this turns out to be the hoax that will not die. It's like, for many journalists and politicians, it's racist to want evidence. So let's all just pretend that these bodies really do exist. In fact, Canada's Museum for Human Rights, just to name one, insists to this day that the remains of 215 children were discovered in unmarked graves in this Catholic school. A mourning ceremony was held for these non-existent children at Fort William just last June. A British academic recently penned an essay on the Kamloops children, accusing whites of having had a grand project of forgetting how they were supposedly mistreated and tossed aside. And Canadian scholars even now say that finding these 215 bodies that don't exist was important.
Drew their attention to not just to Kamloops District Wet'suwet'en or to residential schools in British Columbia, but to residential schools overall, and colonialism and Canada's relationship with colonialism.
A stick to beat colonialism, that's the thing here. A fantasy stick is more important than the truth. Now, I've returned now to this hoax that I first talked about 18 months ago because it could now have poisonous consequences in Australia, in our race debate. The left-wing Guardian Australian newspaper is reporting a shocking story that at Kinchela, now this is an old training home for Aboriginal boys at Kempsey, New South Wales, not Catholic run this time, ground-penetrating radar there has found 9 suspicious places where bodies of dead boys could have been dumped. Doesn't it sound familiar? Another shocking chapter of Australian history. And this time, from what the Guardian claimed, was a home where children were supposedly treated with sadistic abuse, everyday violence and hard labour. Same old, wicked colonial trope. But there was something else that was familiar about this story. The radar technology had discovered these possible graves. Radar technology had become much more prominent after it was used to discover hundreds of suspicious anomalies at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, Canada. 215 unmarked graves believed to be former inmates of the school. Well, to repeat, they weren't unmarked graves. That is fake news. But the Guardian just repeats the lie because it's just too useful to question it. Or perhaps too scary because, you know how it is these days. If you question stories like this, you might be called a racist or even a Holocaust denier. Now, I do not know what they're going to find at Kinchela, but I do know that Justin Trudeau should at least finally confess that he promoted a hoax that's had terrible consequences on Canada's reputation, on race relations, on the Catholic Church. He wanted them to apologise, insisted, and particularly had terrible consequences for all those Christians who had their churches burned down. Justin Trudeau, just say sorry.